Welcome to the Church and Culture Podcast, a weekly discussion with Dr. James Emery White on the latest trends happening in culture and where and how the church should respond. Jim is the founding and senior pastor of Mecklenburg Community Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, president of Serious Times, a ministry devoted to exploring the intersection of faith and culture, former professor of theology and culture at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, where he also served as their fourth president, and the author of more than 20 books. I am your host, Alexis Dry, and I can't wait to dive into this week's conversation. Well, welcome back. Recent data from the CDC's National Center for Health Statistics shows that the uptick of new babies that were born during the COVID-19 pandemic, well, it's officially slowed down. And when I say slowed down, I mean way down. In fact, the current pace of babies born in the U.S. each year has slowed to a record low. Now, prior to the pandemic, birth rates had already been steadily declining about 2% every year. So we are just simply kind of back to where we were in terms of the trend. But historically, it's been economic stresses that often cause parents to put off having children or to scale back on the number of children that they have. In fact, rates have been on a steady decline ever since the recession of 2008. But it's not only economic factors that are hindering today's adults, at least, from having children. And so I thought we could talk about that a little bit today, about what elements are at play. But first, I think we should start with asking, well, why does this even matter? What effect might lower fertility rates have on our future society?
Oh, it's huge.
Yeah.
The birth rate is one of the most basic and important measures in demography. I mean, it really is, but its relevance isn't just limited to demographers. Birth rates affect public policy. They affect budgeting for education and health systems. They can have major impacts on the well-being of a country's population. Governments and policymakers and the news media are very concerned about birth rates, and rightfully so, because the rates, if they get too high or they get too low. As you mentioned, in the United States, and in many other places around the world, birth rates are falling. That's really the story. Not that they're rising, they're falling. And also, as you mentioned, in the United States, the birth rate has been falling since the Great Recession. From 2007 to 2022, it fell 23%. That's just stunning that it would have fallen that much. Today, the average woman, the woman to child ratio is that the average woman has 1.6 children. And that's down from 3 in the United States. And the replacement rate, which is kind of code for what it takes for a population to stay the same, just plateaued, is 2.1. So we're below the replacement rate to sustain a stable population. So our population is going down. So is that good? Is that bad? Is that meaningless? Well, it certainly isn't meaningless. There are some that might say that there's an uptick to it, a good side to it. Lower birth rates around the world could lessen environmental degradation. Competition for resources. Some might make the argument that it would lessen global conflict, but not many are ringing that bell. It's the negative side that people are concerned about, and that there's just almost complete uniform agreement on. And when I talk about the negative side, we're talking about aging societies, declining populations, fewer and fewer young people available to pay the taxes and to consume the goods needed to sustain a society and to sustain pensions and healthcare and other necessities. The drop has really frightened lawmakers and commentators alike, with headlines warning of a demographic crisis, or sometimes you see the headline, "The Great People Shortage." And as economies are finding themselves, they just don't have enough young workers to fill jobs and to pay the taxes. It really has caused great concern. Declining fertility has stoked anxieties around the world as leaders face down the prospect of slowing growth and, again, aging populations. Fewer births really do have consequences for how families and how societies operate. Let me just give you one example, just so that we understand this on a personal level. In 2010, there were more than 7 family members available to care for each person over the age of 80. That was the norm. If you were a person over the age of 80, you had at least 7 family members that would care for you. By 2030, there's only going to be 4. And it's only going to get worse. So you're going to have not just an aging population, but nobody to care for them. An aging society also means fewer workers in really key industries. And also, I mean, speaking of the United States, fewer people paying into programs like Social Security. So on the bottom end, you've got fewer people putting into Social Security, and on the top end, a much larger number pulling out. That's obviously not very sustainable.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about what's behind this. So it's interesting that as we're seeing this steady decline in fertility rates, we're also simultaneously seeing a steady increase in the number of Americans who are delaying or foregoing marriage altogether. And we've talked on the podcast before about the devaluation of the Christian institution of marriage, but I do think it's worthwhile to bring it up again in relation to this topic. Can you remind our listeners as to why fewer adults are pursuing marriage?
Well, part of it is that they're living together. And anecdotally, that's what you would think would be the majority of it. But it's certainly, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but it is that there's a lot of people foregoing marriage and just living together. And it's become normalized and mainstream in our world. In fact, even among those who are married, 70% lived together first. That's a lot, 7 out of every 10, even of all the marrieds. And, it's interesting. I get it. I really do. I don't agree with it, but I get it. It seems like you have everything to win and absolutely nothing to lose by living together first. It's like taking a car for a test drive. I mean, who wants to buy a car you've never sat behind the wheel would be the thinking. It seems to make sense that you want to live together for a season first to see whether you should live together for life. If you don't live together first, and then you find out during that first week of marriage that you cannot stand living with this person, well, that just seems like a recipe for divorce. So a lot of people actually say, I don't want to get divorced, which is why I want to live together first. Again, I think that's flawed thinking, but, I've heard people say, well, what if they snore, right? We have thermostat wars and they're slobs and I'm a neat freak, or the bathroom, they don't lift the lid, or the worst sin of all, they don't hang the toilet paper roll right. They hang it from the back instead of the front. And we all know that that's not sustainable.
Unforgivable, yeah.
So when it comes to not living together first, a lot of people say, well, what's not to like? And besides, isn't it a natural, almost organic progression in the relationship? I mean, you date, you live together, and then you see whether marriage is for you, step by step into ever increasing levels of commitment, or at least step by step into seeing whether there can be increasing levels of commitment. And then, you throw in all the practical, logistical stuff. I need a roommate to share the rent, so why not who I'm dating, and in our world, who I'm already sleeping with sexually? I mean, so it's not like, what's the big taboo? I mean, it's not like it's going to change it. We're already active sexually, so why not just have this help out with the rent? Or I'm moving to a new city or a new job, and we don't want to break up, and so she moves with me. And it's too expensive to have 2 separate apartments. And then there's just the sheer expense of a wedding. One survey I ran across found that 73% of all Gen Zers and millennials said, I'm not getting married because it's just too dang expensive. The average cost of a wedding right now is $30,000. Oh, that's a lot of money. And as someone who has had 4 children, 2 of them daughters, who had the sensitive, caring, compassionate heart to get married 6 months apart, I'm in favor of eloping at the very least. But anyway, that's the thinking about living together before marriage that you hear. And so that's obviously a cultural issue. But here's the thing. We talked about this on that one previous podcast some too, and I would encourage people to go back and listen to it, and we'll put it in the show notes. But here's what's interesting. Only 22%, that's not really what's driving it. Living together. Only 22% of people who are unmarried between the ages of 40 and 44 are currently living with somebody. Almost 80% aren't. So what's the real reason for the decline in marriage culturally? Okay, living together or the mainstreaming of that's a part of it. But I think that the average person, the bigger issue is they're just finding the whole idea of marriage outdated. and it's just not needed. It's not foundational for their life. And in an increasingly secular world, that shouldn't surprise us, because marriage has been historically um, a faith-based act. It's been rooted in spiritual faith. It's been a religious ceremony. It's the thing that's officiated by a religious figure. I mean, it's rooted in that, and as people distance themselves from that, then marriage often can get lumped in with that as well. So I think those are some of the reasons.
Yeah, well, so that's marriage on one hand, and then you have women too who are waiting until later in life to start families. Whether that's because they want to prioritize their education or careers, or just wanting to get married later. But birth rates, for example, for moms in their 20s have declined, whereas there has been a slight uptick in and births to women in their 30s or 40s, but just not, it's not apples to apples. I mean, there's more of a decline than an uptick. And additionally, women globally have greater access to contraceptives now, so they have more control over their family planning. It was interesting. I read a BBC journalist who was commenting on this because, like you said, it's a big deal not only in the U.S. but globally, and about this point in particular about how women have more control basically over the planning for having babies. He said, in many ways, falling fertility rates are a success story. Would you agree with that?
But before I answer that, it's interesting you talk about older women who are older having more babies. One of the reasons is it's not just a matter of choice, but possibility. That the advances in medical science has made it more and more possible to have successful pregnancies later on. my oldest daughter had her fourth child. I think she was 36, and they put her, they called her the geriatric category, and she did not appreciate that. But anyway, you're having them later because you can. Mm-hmm. I think that's part of it too. But also, let's state something else. The longer you wait to start, that affects birth rates. Before I get to what you were saying, the longer you wait to start having children, the greater the chance that you will have fewer children or even end up having none at all, because eventually you do age out of your childbearing years, just physically. But back to your question, in the sense of how I think that person from the BBC meant it. It has changed things for the better for women. Our culture as a whole would say it has been very, very positive. As you mentioned, being more in control of when you have a baby or the number of babies that you have has allowed more women to pursue education, to have careers in the workforce, to answer callings that are vocational. Because traditionally, and we don't need to get into the good, bad, or indifferent of this, but traditionally, if there's a baby in the picture, the woman is the one to forego education. The woman is the one to give up her career and stay home and care for that child. So this puts a woman in control of her life in that area. So in that regard, there's little doubt that something like the pill has revolutionized the lives of women around the world. Mm-hmm. Most culturally would say for the better. Mm-hmm. But there's another dynamic at play for those who are Christians. Christians are divided, as you know, on whether a woman using birth control is on the whole a positive thing or even a biblical thing. Largely, the divide is between Catholics and Protestants. Catholic teaching forbids birth control in almost every form. Protestant Christians tend to widely accept it, or at least to be comfortable taking advantage of it. The Roman Catholic view is that you have to view things from the very beginning, even before conception. They believe that procreation is intrinsic to the physical union of the couple. And while embryos are not to be looked at as children, they should be seen as having the potential of life that develops, the promise of life that develops into a child. That's why they don't support the use of the pill or of condoms. Condoms, as well as the pill, prevents a life from taking place. It artificially prevents conception. Therefore, it prevents life. Same with something like an IUD or getting a vasectomy or having your tubes tied. Anything that isn't natural is considered the prevention of life. Yet, even they employ the method of controlling things, such as the rhythm method of birth control. And some people kind of look at them as being a little disingenuous with that, but that's another conversation. But of course, if this goes beyond just the use, of birth control and we bring in the issue of abortion, that's another question altogether. But barring the abortion question for a moment, or for this podcast, most would say that culturally, in terms of women and opportunity in birth control, it's been a very positive thing. But that doesn't mean that falling birth rates, as we've already talked about, are a positive thing.
Right. I think another factor worth talking about is just, and at least in terms of the US specifically, is just the unique challenges that are facing parents today. Now, parents throughout history will tell you that childbearing has never been easy, but I think what makes it especially challenging today is just how fractured of a society that we live in. I think of that common adage that it takes a village to raise a child, and I couldn't agree more with that. But the problem is that just so many of us don't have a village now. We don't have help, and it makes the thought of raising children for so many just daunting almost. Would you agree with that?
Let's talk about that. First, I know you don't have the baggage associated with that village idea that some of us who are older might. It was actually the title of a book written by Hillary Clinton in 1996. And the idea was that children need individuals and groups outside of the family, and advocated for a society that meets those needs. In other words, and there was a lot of controversy with that idea because some felt it was making the case for big government, family intervention. Let us take over. You can't do it. It takes a village. No, it takes a society. It takes a government. It takes policies. We need to come alongside and help you raise your child, and to kind of subvert or overtake or replace the parental role, and that somehow parents weren't enough. That was the debate. That was kind of what was meant by the way a lot of people read that book, was how it takes a village. In other words, and when her husband, Bill Clinton, ran for president against Bob Dole in 1996, that's when she released that book. It was right in the heat of the campaign. And Dole famously said, as part of that campaign about Hillary's book, he said, "I must disagree. It doesn't take a village to raise a child. It takes a family." But I think what you mean, and the way you're using the adage, is that those parents, that family, needs the support of a community, which is, of course, you're right, a deeply biblical idea we should all sign off on. We need support structures, and we need lifelines. We don't have them. Raising a child can be overwhelming and frightening and just daunting. I recently taught on the subject of IVF and abortion here at MEC as part of a series. That was an interesting series. It would be almost more an interesting podcast on just how we did it. I mean, because as you know, we, through our social media, surveyed people and said, we're going to do a series called "What Does the Bible Really Say About?" You fill in the blanks. What do you want to most hear what the Bible really says about it? And they came back with 5 gut-wrenching it's like, I got to do a series on these 5. Oh my gosh. But one of them that they asked for was on abortion and IVF, and which we all know has so been in the news, and that shouldn't have surprised us. But one of the points I made was this village idea that you just raised, and it was about having compassion in this area. And if you believe someone shouldn't get a first trimester abortion, if that's your view, you need to stand with those people who unexpectedly, unwantedly get pregnant and decide to carry that child full term. Most of them, statistically, are going to be young, single parent moms. They will not have personal support. They won't have much in the way of money or resources. So if you believe that they shouldn't have gotten an abortion, be there for them when they don't. Because if you really want to stem the tide of a lot of abortions, then that's going to be a biblical village that's going to have to surround that person, because they're going to need it. And
Yeah. Well, how do you think society will aim to compensate for falling fertility rates?
This has almost been funny to follow. And if you've read about this, I can tell you how they're trying to do it. They're not adjusting for it. They're fighting it. They're trying to get people to have more babies. That's the biggest thing. They're trying to get more babies and bigger families. And they're incentivizing. They're trying to incentivize having children. And it's almost comical. The funniest country to me is Taiwan. They have spent more than $3 billion trying to get their citizens to have more children. And it goes all the way back to 2000 and mid 2009. After decades of falling birth rates, they began offering first 6 months of paid parental leave. It's a long time. Then they introduced a cash benefit and a tax break for parents of young children. Then they invested in childcare centers to provide free childcare. Then they started recently the idea to try to get people into, they tried to go back further and just get people to hook up. I don't know how else to put it. They tried to get people into relationships that could result in children. And so they actually have started to have government-sponsored singles mixers. Yep. There's even a proposal right now I just read about from a person I think he's running for president or somewhere in office there. He's proposing giving people a free pet if they have a child. None of it's working. Yeah, I know. I don't want a kid. Why do you think I want a pet? But it's not working, and historically, incentives have never worked, interestingly. No matter what governments do to try and convince people to have children, people around the world are simply choosing to have fewer kids. I mentioned earlier that the U.S. birth rate has fallen to about 1.6%, meaning the average American woman has about 1.6 children. The replacement rate needed to keep a population stable is 2.1 children per woman. Taiwan, with all that it's doing, has a fertility rate of 0.87. Wow. It doesn't work. Yet with all of those incentives, you still read surveys that people say that they would have more children if they could. They just feel they can't. And when you ask them, well, why? They say, well, money. Mm-hmm. Money, which is why some feel the solution is to incentivize, but in very specific ways that would make it less burdensome is to address the lack of family-friendly policies like paid leave, subsidized childcare, those kinds of things. In a 2018 poll, there was about a quarter of all respondents said that they had or were planning to have fewer kids than they would ideally like to have. And of those, 64% said it's the cost of childcare. Mm-hmm. And it is. It's really, and childcare is significant because if both of you have to work, decent childcare is what, $10,000, $15,000 a year? Oh, I mean, it's a big or more, and it's a big chunk out of someone's income. Mm-hmm. Another dynamic at play that we haven't talked about, and there's really nothing that can be done about this, but it's just a fear factor in relation to having children. Fears for the future just play a huge role in declining birth rates. Young adults are living in a world that's just characterized by crisis. You have war, you have climate change, you have so many different things. And I've heard people, and I'm sure you have too, anecdotally just say, I just don't want to bring a child into this kind of world. And so as a result, they don't.
Well, since we always strive to bring a Christian worldview to the topics that we're talking about, I can't help but think about sort of discussing, solutions or what we're going to do about this. And I can't help to think about what the church has to offer. I mean, the church, when it's at its best, let me clarify, is where true community and care and support can take place. It's where you see, this beautiful vision of family. It's how, I don't know, it promotes marriage, it promotes family, it protects the vulnerable, it honors women, it offers authentic community to the lonely. How do you see the church being able to do that or to be a beacon here?
So you did it again. You gave the answer in your question. It's like I want to say what you said. What the church has to offer the world is the church being the church. and where true community and care and support takes place, where marriage is promoted. I mean, you said it beautifully. Where the vulnerable are protected and where women are honored and where authentic community to the lonely is offered. That's the solution. But on a practical level, that's going to mean rolling up your sleeves and having the church put that rhetoric into some type of actual set of practices, actual programs and teachings and ministries and support networks. You have to be intentional about marriage and family as ministries, intentional about supporting marriage and family. At our last Church and Culture conference, I was so proud of our one of our panels at our last Church and Culture spring ministry workshops. So it was. We had an entire seminar talking about what we're doing here at MEC for supporting marriage and families and children. And I remember we had on the panel, we had folks from MEC Kids, we had people from the MEC Institute, and I can't remember who else we had, but it was just it. And I remember just sitting back, hearing them talk about all that we're doing, and I was so proud of our church and the hard work of our staff and of our volunteers, and the thought put into it, and the intentionality and the strategy, and it was just and I was proud of our church, but I was also sitting back thinking, this is just what every church needs to be trying to move toward and do, but sadly many churches don't. So
Yeah. Well, this has been a great conversation. And like I said, I'm glad we had it because it's not just the US that's having this conversation, it's the whole world. And I'm so interested to see how, how people respond. And particularly, as you said, how the church responds, how we can be a beacon of light, how we can actually provide hope in the fear factor element of having kids. Because, while we can't control the future, we can control the support that people have moving ahead. And then also, the supernatural God who's in love with them. And there's just so much. So I'm really grateful to have had this conversation. So, and again, grateful for you guys for tuning in for this. I hope you catch more episodes if this is your first time listening, but we definitely hope you'll check us out next week. Thanks.